Hi all, this is Steph Giordano with Human Services Research Institute, or HSRI. Welcome to this 2019-2020 National Core Indicators Data Collection Cycle. You are currently watching this year's refresher training for the in-person survey data collection. So just a note before we get started, this is a refresher training, meaning that it is only for those of you who have collected in-person surveys in the field in previous years and have completed a full training in the past 4 years. So what we'll cover today is a brief review of the National Core Indicators program. We'll talk about the administration of the in-person survey. So we'll go over the structure of the survey itself. We'll talk about the use of proxies as well as some communication strategies for meeting with people in the field. We'll also talk about best practices for conducting the in-person survey and wrap up with some frequently asked questions about the questions in the survey tool. So just a note here, after following this training, you will be asked to complete a post-training assessment. It's a brief quiz that asks some questions just about the essential elements of this training, which really go to the an administration and protocol for conducting the in-person surveys in the field. Right, so we're going to start out with this national and a very brief state-level overview of national core indicators. And the goals of this section are to make sure that you can comfortably speak to participants, families, staff, and other potentially interested parties about national core indicators. This information is really important to be able to convey in order to make sure that people are comfortable with the program and willing to participate in doing the survey. So in order to do that, it's important that we understand what the NCI program is as well as its purpose. And it's important that you make sure that you are aware of how your state will be using NCI data as well. So what is NCI? National Core Indicators started back in 1997 with the goal of helping states understand whether the services and supports for people being served by DD systems were working well and helping them to live a good life. NCI is a collaboration between the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services, or NASDS, as well as the organization I am with, HSRI. It is a voluntary effort by public DD agencies to measure and track their own performance. We currently have 46 states as well as Washington D.C. Represented as a National Core Indicators state. So here's a map of our currently participating states. And what's important to keep in mind when you take a look at this is, although you are of course focused on National Core Indicators in your state, the program really is national in scope. So last year, close to 30,000 surveys were completed across the United States. So it's important to remember that the work that you're doing is not only beneficial to the people who live around you, but you're also helping to set national benchmarks and give a better picture of how well systems are doing for people with DD really across the United States. I also like to mention the various survey tools that NCI uses, and so states may choose to use one or all of these surveys each year, but we have the in-person survey, of course, which is what we're focused on today. We also have 3 family surveys, and these are surveys that get mailed to family members or sometimes the guardian of an adult with DD who lives in or out of the family home. We also have a family survey that is sent to family members of a child with DD who lives with the family member in the home. We also have what we see at the bottom there, the staff stability tool, and that goes to providers within a state and takes a look at state-level data on things like staff wages, benefits, and turnover rates. So the purpose of NCI is to establish a nationally recognized set of performance and outcome indicators for DD services and to use valid and reliable data collection methods and tools in order to do that. So NCI has over 20 years of information about people receiving services that's been collected directly from those individuals and families. The information collected is systems level data, meaning that the information that's provided to states or that you can access is not about the individual people who are surveyed, but informs states about how the systems are working overall. So NCI collects information on important outcomes around quality of life, service satisfaction, and other key areas of importance, things like employment, choice, healthcare. These data taken together provide national benchmarks and allow for states to look at themselves compared to a national average, as well as look at themselves compared to other states, and also be able to track their performance over time, so see where there may be changes that occur. So really briefly, NCI states use data in a whole host of ways. If you do not already know how your state is using or plans to use the NCI data, I would strongly encourage that you talk to your NCI coordinator. It's really helpful to know what your state is doing, in part because it's good for you to know what your work is going to, but it's also a great way to be able to talk to participants and family members and staff about why they're taking the time to complete the survey is really important. So some states use NCI data for quality assurance and to, of course, improve the services that they provide to individuals with DD as well as their families. States may use some of these data for CMS waiver requirements. We've talked a bit about those state-to-state comparisons that can be made. To assist with community transition, and what this really means is that there are some states that use NCI data to look at people who are leaving institutional settings and moving into the community and making sure that that transition is going smoothly. A number of states will set up quality and DD councils to discuss NCI as well as other data sources and make recommendations to the DD agency. And states, of course, use this information to report to state legislatures as well. So again, if you're unsure if your state falls into any of these buckets for using NCI data, please do talk to your coordinator so that you can have a good understanding of why NCI is being used in your state. All right, now taking a look at the NCI in-person survey, we'll look at the structure of the survey itself and talk about some guidelines for administering the in-person survey. Overall objectives here is just to make sure that we all understand the process for conducting the in-person survey and to know the general guidelines for administering the survey. So taking a person-centered approach to the NCI survey is really, really important. National Core Indicators was developed with the primary objective of getting information directly from people receiving services. The questions we ask are specific to important person-centered outcomes, so things like satisfaction, choice, service coordination, and things of that nature. The approach that you take to the survey meeting should also keep the person at the forefront. The person's perspective is the absolute priority of the meeting. And as much as possible, we want to hear directly from the person receiving services. So remember, we do have some questions that can be answered by a proxy if needed, but again, as much as possible, we do want to hear directly from the person receiving services. Getting the person's perspective also means that you may get a response at times that you either don't agree with or maybe you feel is incorrect. However, we always want to take the person's response so long as you've done the work to make sure that the person is understanding the question and giving a reliable answer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We also consider this a guided conversation. So where with other surveys you may ask a question, get an answer, and move on to the next question, we're really, really wanting to make sure that people are able to understand what's being asked and give the most appropriate response for them. This means that sometimes you'll have to do a little bit of following up, rephrasing, or probing questions to make sure that the person understands and is given a response that is true to them, and that you're able to quote the most appropriate responses as well. Finally, to make sure that the person feels comfortable and that the survey is not disrupting things that are going on in the person's life or daily activities, we want the person to be able to choose when and where to meet as much as possible. Most often the survey will be done at the person's home. However, if they want to meet at a day program or perhaps a restaurant or a coffee shop, that's absolutely fine too if that's where they prefer. So keeping in mind this person-centered approach, this is some information that you could share with participants before starting the meeting. Some of this is also helpful to remind the person about as you go through the survey meeting as well. So the survey itself is completely voluntary, meaning that people are not at all required to take the survey. They are also not required to answer every question in the survey. So if there are certain questions the person's not comfortable answering, they can go ahead and just skip it. There are no right or wrong answers, so again, we're just looking for the person's perspective here. The survey is confidential, meaning that no one outside of the meeting will know how the person answered questions. And because of that, the intent of the survey really is not to directly affect individual services. So taking part in the survey does not mean that the person's services will change, they won't have added services or anything taken away. So I do just want to note here that these last 2 points are really important reminders. However, there may be some limited circumstances where they don't necessarily hold true. One instance is if there is anything that comes up around abuse, neglect, or exploitation where you may have to report something. Of course, then the survey is no longer confidential. The other is in the instance of unmet need. Neither of those topics are going to be discussed in this refresher training, but it is really, really critical that you know your state's protocol for mandated reporting as well as unmet need. And you can talk to your NCI coordinator if you need to get more information about that. And of course the NCI survey structure, which you should be familiar with, but just a reminder here. So we have the pre-survey information. This is that information that is used to help you set up and conduct the meeting. It includes some basic contact information for the person. It also includes some places where you can put in familiar names and terms that you're able to use throughout the survey to make it more conversational for the person and also help them be better able to understand what's being asked. This section is not information that is used in any way by HSRI or by the state. It is only for you. So if this information is not collected by the time of the survey meeting, you do not have to collect this separately. Then we have the background information. So this is information that's collected by the state. It's information about the person's demographics and some personal characteristics of the individual. This largely comes from administrative records, but there may be some items that you would collect in the field. We'll talk about that really, really briefly a little bit later on. Section 1 are those more subjective questions, so the things like whether the person likes where they live, there are places where they feel afraid or scared, things that really only the person can answer, and for that reason, only the person receiving services may answer. Reminder here that even though Section 1 can only be answered by the person receiving services, it is absolutely okay if the person needs any kind of support to facilitate communication. So perhaps having a translator or interpreter available, the person should still go through Section 1. Section 2 then are the more objective questions. So how many times have you gone out into the community to go shopping, for instance? We always, as much as possible, want the person receiving services to answer Section 2. However, if needed or if the person wants some support for answering some questions, a proxy can be used here. And finally, we have that surveyor feedback form. This is for you to fill out after the survey meeting takes place. It details some information about the survey meeting itself and also is an opportunity for you to let us know how the survey works in the field. So if there are any questions that you have issues with or that seem problematic, you can let us know there. Proxy assistance, a favorite topic here. So we're going to talk a little bit about when and how to use proxy assistance. All right, so what we want to make sure that we know here is what a proxy is. We want to make sure that you understand how proxies can be used to be able to determine when a proxy should be used to complete Section 2 of the survey. and to know who can serve as a proxy respondent. As you know, NCI allows for proxy respondents to be used in two ways. So in some cases, a proxy will complete a survey on behalf of the person. Now this happens when the person is unable to answer any questions in section 1 of the survey. So after you go through a few questions, you realize the person's just not able to give valid or reliable responses. In that case, we would thank the person for their time and then ask if it's okay to talk to a family member or staff or somebody who knows the person well and can serve as a proxy. A proxy respondent may also be somebody who is not completing section 2 in its entirety for the person. However, they could help out with some questions where the person gets a little bit stuck. So they might just need help remembering an answer, or just might want to look over to the proxy to give a response here and there, and that's absolutely fine as well. It's good practice to let the person know at the start of section 2 that they can have assistance from a proxy if they would like it. It's also good practice that if you do have somebody who may serve as a proxy for section 2, to remind that person that we're still hoping to get information directly from the person receiving services first. We want to make sure that the proxy doesn't start to answer all of the questions on behalf of the person in section 2 if it's not necessary. A really important note at the bottom here, translators and interpreters are not proxies. These are people who can help support and facilitate the conversation you're having with the person, but really their job is just to relay the information that you're asking to the person and give that information that the person gives back to you. They should not be speaking on behalf of the person though. So first, the need for a proxy must be made in person, meaning that if you're perhaps talking to a family member or staff person to set up a meeting, even if they say that this person is just not going to be able to answer any questions, we still want you to let that person know, the family member or staff person, that you'll have to try at least a couple of questions with the person receiving services. However, it would be helpful if they can be available or can recommend somebody who knows the person well, who can be available at the time of the meeting in case the person's not able to answer your questions. So once you are in person, you should attempt the first 4 or so questions of the survey with the person receiving services. These first few questions are those ones about satisfaction with the home. They tend to be a bit helpful in kind of easing the person into the survey. They're a little bit easier to answer and tend to elicit more positive responses. Sometimes it'll be clear before you get through those first 4 questions that the person simply is not going to be able to answer the questions in section 1. That's absolutely okay, and you can move on to section 2 in that case. In other instances, the person may be able to answer a couple of those questions. So if the person is able to answer at least some questions reliably, even if there is some rephrasing that's needed and some follow-up to get appropriate responses, we still want you to continue on with section 1 of the survey. It's only if the person is unable to answer any questions in section 1 reliably that you would skip over to section 2. And just note throughout the survey, we do have that 99 don't know unclear response. So if the person's unable to answer a particular question or doesn't want to, you can always use that response option if needed. So end of section 1 question to surveyors. This is that question that asks whether the person was able to answer the questions in section 1 in a reliable manner. This is a super, super important question. This is used to determine whether section 1 data are included in the state results, meaning whether that person's voice is going to be reflected in the information that the state receives. So if any questions in section 1 were answered reliably, we would check this question off as yes. The person was able to give reliable answers. That's the case even if the person was only able to answer 2 or 3 questions in section 1, that's absolutely fine, as long as they were able to answer in a valid and reliable way. If that's the case, we check off that yes, the person answered those few questions reliably, and the rest of the questions would have been marked as that don't know unclear response. It's only if the person did not answer any questions in section 1 reliably that you would check off no, the person was not able to answer in a reliable manner. Really, really important here, we do not want you to overuse that no response. I've talked a bit about ensuring that people are providing reliable responses, but what does that really mean? So providing reliable answers generally means two things. One, the person seems to understand the questions that are being asked, and this is demonstrated by the person being able to give a response that's fitting to the question. And remember now, it's okay if the person needs some help with rephrasing, or perhaps you have to follow up to the person's initial answer to get at the appropriate response, but ultimately you're able to get a response that is consistent with what's being asked. The other way that reliability is demonstrated is that the person gives consistent answers, meaning that from question to question on a similar topic, answers don't seem to stray too far. And just a final reminder here, a person may be giving reliable answers even if they need a translator or interpreter to help facilitate communication, or if they need questions repeated or explained, or if you have to do a little bit of probing in order to get at the appropriate response. So let's watch a clip of a survey taking place. This is a survey with Dana, and Cheryl's a surveyor here. And at the end, we want to think about whether Dana is giving valid and reliable responses.
You like your home or where you live?
Nice.
It's nice? Would you like to live somewhere else?
Yes. I got May.
You will?
Who do you want to live with, Dana? Dana, who do you want to live with?
May.
You want to live with May?
Yes.
That's an old lead staff member from at least 7 years ago.
Okay.
And she does see her.
Yeah.
She continues to see her, but so I thought that was interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's helpful for us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dana, do people let you know before they come into your home? Do they ring the doorbell or knock first and wait for an answer?
No, at 4 o'clock.
No, 4 o'clock.
No? At 4 o'clock? Do people let you know before coming into your bedroom?
4 o'clock. Oh, yeah.
Dana, did you hear a question?
Yeah.
Ask it again.
Yeah.
Do people let you know before they come into your bedroom?
I May.
You may.
Okay.
You may come into her bedroom.
Okay. Thank you. Do you have a place to be alone in your home?
Okay.
Okay. Dana, is it okay if I ask Becky some of the questions?
What?
Can she ask me questions?
Okay.
It's okay.
That's okay? Okay.
Okay, welcome back. So after viewing that clip, we get to this question, that end of section 1 question. In your opinion, did Dana appear to understand the questions that were answered? And did the person, Dana, answer in a consistent manner? How do we answer this? And in this case, we would say that yes, Dana did seem to give consistent and valid responses to the questions that she answered. And that's because there are a few questions that Dana was able to answer, but whether she likes her home, she says it's nice. And if she wants to live somewhere else, and she says yes with May. When Cheryl asks more questions about whether people ask before coming into Dana's home or bedroom, she says you may, but the response is a little bit unclear about whether people knock first or if that's an answer that she gives if it is okay to enter. So in this case, you would have coded yes to questions 1 and 3 and coded others as don't know, unclear. So just talking a little bit about when a proxy is helping out with section 2 of the survey. So again, we want to always make sure that we are assuming the person who's receiving services can answer questions. So we want to make sure that the proxy does not begin to talk over the person or answering before the person has time to come up with their own response. So remember that the survey should be a conversation between you and the person who's receiving services. That proxy is really just there to kind of support the person as needed. If the person in the proxy do give conflicting answers, we want you to do some follow-up to determine if you can get at the appropriate response. If after some follow-up the appropriate answer is still unclear, you would just check off that 99 don't know unclear response. There is, as you should remember, a respondent box for every question in section 2. So the respondent box only allows for one respondent type, but we do need it checked off for each question in section 2. So if a person and proxy answer together in the same way, you would check off that the individual provided an answer. If a family member who serves as the person's staff is serving as a proxy, you would mark that relationship as family. When a proxy is completing section 2 on behalf of the person, do remember that we have that other respondent phrasing, which just changes the language of questions to ask about the person rather than ask a question to the person. So who can serve as a proxy? Of course, really important here, it has to be somebody who knows the person really well. Questions that the proxy can answer are specific to the services that the person receives. We have those questions around daily activities, and so the proxy really does have to know the person well and have enough history to be able to speak to the person's experiences. Generally, the proxy will be a family member, so perhaps a parent, a sibling, a spouse, or other relative. Staff may also serve as a proxy if needed. Again, only if staff have worked with the person for a while, so you don't want a staff person who just is on a shift but maybe doesn't really know the person. You really need somebody who has worked with the person for quite some time. Guardians can serve as proxies. However, it's important to remember that they're not always the best person to serve as the proxy respondent. Guardians are not always the people who spend the most time with the person or have the most knowledge of the person's daily activities. And it is best practice to let the person choose who he or she feels most comfortable with serving as a proxy if it's needed. Last note here, case managers cannot serve as proxy respondents. That's the only relationship that we really do not allow our case managers as proxies, and that's just to avoid any kind of conflict of interest. So let's wrap up this talk about proxy respondents here with just some reminders from what we've covered. Section 1 should be considered valid even if the person cannot answer all questions but is able to answer some of the questions throughout Section 1. That is absolutely fine. Going into that is that we do not want to overuse proxies. So as much as possible, we want to hear directly from people receiving services. Again, a reminder here, translators and interpreters are not proxies. They are somebody who facilitates conversation between you and the person. It is a good practice to let the person know when you're setting up the meeting that they can have somebody present who can help out with some questions if they might want it. And the last note here, you do just want to be sure that the person who will serve as a proxy is somebody who does in fact know the person well and can speak to their daily activities. Okay, so these are some new slides if you've done this refresher a few times in the past. We want to talk a little bit about communication strategy, and this is really about finding the best way to communicate with each person you talk with. So let's start off with some of the foundation here. So crucial to remember that intellect and communication are not one and the same. Every person communicates a bit differently, and those differences in communication style or even ability do not indicate a person's ability to understand or answer questions. It's really helpful to take time before you start the survey to determine how the person best communicates, and this goes for anybody you meet with. It's helpful to ask a couple of open-ended as well as yes and no questions, and this can just help you better understand how the person thinks about and responds to questions. And if a person uses a communication device, you want to just get to know how that will work as well. So using translators and interpreters should be done as needed. So sometimes you'll need a translator or interpreter because a person maybe doesn't speak your language. Perhaps if the person is nonverbal and does not use a communication style that you're familiar with, but there is somebody available who does. You may also use a translator or interpreter if the person's communication style is not one that you are able to understand. Unless a person's communication style does not allow for this, translators or interpreters should sit next to you. Now this helps because then the translation can be done along with you as you're asking questions or immediately following the question. It also helps to make sure that you're not looking at the interpreter when you're asking a question rather than the person. Because as you see in this last point, of course, it's always so crucial that you continue to focus your attention on the person, not the translator or interpreter. And the last few points here around tone and quality of voice. So you want to be aware of your vocal quality and the tone of your voice. Be sure to speak clearly and at a steady pace, and certainly you want to avoid being too loud or too soft. If you're meeting with a person who reads lips, you just want to be aware of your positioning. In very rare cases, and only as a last resort, survey questions can be read by the person. If this is the case, and again, it should happen very rarely, if ever, but you want to sit next to the person and first establish a way of getting responses from the person. So either using picture cards to depict a yes, in between, or no response, as well as how the person will tell you that they don't know the response. This could also be used with hand gestures or writing or any other methods that you think of in order to facilitate that conversation. As you go through the survey, we'll want you to cover the survey aside from the question that's being asked, so the person is only reading the question that you're focused on at the moment. We don't want you to show the response options, but again, instead, after the person reads the question, we want them to give you the response using whatever means of communication that you've decided upon. We would also ask that you include a note in the survey or feedback form that this was the method of collecting the survey information, by having the person read questions on their own. All right, let's talk now about some best practices for conducting the survey meeting. We'll start with talking about initial contact, and of course this is incredibly important because this is the first time that the person will be meeting you, even if over the phone. So this is the time that we want to make sure that we get the person feeling comfortable about the survey meeting and agreeing to participate in the survey. Some things to keep in mind: you do want the person as much as possible to be able to decide when and where to meet. Most often, of course, you'll be meeting in the person's home, but you could also meet at a day program or a coffee shop or diner. Just a reminder, if the meeting is going to be held in a group home or some other congregate residential setting, perhaps even a day program, you may want to contact the front desk or someone who works there to make sure that you have your name in a visitor log if there is one. Make sure that the time that you've set up with the person doesn't conflict with anything else that may be going on during that day. And if there are anything like parking considerations or things that you should be aware of before you arrive at the facility, so that you're not creating barriers to getting to the meeting on time. If there is another person who will be expected at the meeting, so perhaps a potential proxy or somebody who the person just wants there to feel more comfortable, you just want to make sure that all of the times work well and are convenient for everyone who will be involved. And of course, make sure that you know whether there are any additional accommodations that you'll need to be aware of. If you call to set up a meeting and the phone contact you have does not work, you want to, of course, inform your NCI coordinator. Also know that some people may run out of minutes, so if you're trying toward the end of the month, maybe try again at the beginning of the following month when the person may have minutes on their phone again. We suggest attempting at least 5 callbacks. Now this is a number that is dependent on states, so you'll want to talk to your NCI coordinator to know exactly how many times you should attempt to set up a meeting with a person. We do, however, suggest that you call on different days and times just to make sure that you're not always calling at a time when the person is out doing something. Leaving a message is not suggested. However, If you do leave a voicemail for a person, even if it's on their personal cell phone, be aware of the person's privacy. Do not ever mention that you are calling to conduct an NCI survey or that the call is regarding services that the person receives through the state. And that's just because that can become a violation of HIPAA. Alright, so arriving and finding the right space to meet, starting off with some general considerations. If it's a rainy, snowy, muddy kind of day, you might want to bring a clean pair of shoes so you're not tracking mud through a person's house. Always bring water so that you can stay hydrated throughout the survey. If you're doing multiple surveys in a day, you might want to bring some snacks as well. If you get to a person's home and they offer you food or water, we do ask that you try to decline politely, so you can say, thank you, I just ate, or I have some water with me. But if you feel like the person might be offended that you're not going to accept something from them, it's okay to accept some food or water if it seems impolite not to do so. So as much as possible, we do want you to meet with the person one-on-one, but that will not always be the case, and that's all right. We do always want you, though, to avoid having too many people present at the meeting. Really, more than one additional person starts to be too many people. That's just because you start to have to juggle with hearing from several people. It can cause a little bit more of a commotion and become a distraction. As much as possible, you want to have that additional person sit behind the person who you're talking with, and that just helps take that extra person out of the conversation physically. It also means that if they're giving any kind of nonverbal cues, that the person maybe is answering in a way that they think is correct or incorrect, that person won't be distracted by seeing those cues. We don't want you to assume that that additional person is there to provide answers. So just because somebody is sitting and supporting the person with their being present, it does not mean that the person receiving services needs support answering questions in section 2. And it's really, really important at the beginning of the meeting to be very clear about roles. So making sure that that extra person knows that when you're asking those section 1 questions, only the person can respond. To illustrate some situational awareness here, we'll take a look first at a picture of this meeting taking place. What we see here is on the left-hand side, a staff person sitting. In the middle is the surveyor. Now on the right-hand side is the person who's taking the survey. Now this is not good practice, and that's because it looks really like the staff person and the person receiving services are having the conversation. The surveyor is really kind of out of the conversation completely. What we really want is for the surveyor and the person receiving services to be looking directly at each other and having that staff person be sort of out of sight. So ideally, she would be moved to the far right-hand side. On the other hand, this is a depiction of a best practice for setting up. So what we see here is on the far left-hand side, the surveyor who is conducting the survey, of course. In the middle and sort of behind everyone is a staff person, and on the right-hand side is the person who is taking the survey. We see very clearly that this is a conversation between the surveyor and the person completing the survey. That staff person is really kind of out of sight. Now some tips around conducting the survey meeting. So getting started, important to take a moment for some icebreakers. This of course helps to make the person feel more comfortable. We talked a little bit earlier, but this can also help support you better understand how the person best communicates. It also can help give insight into things like maybe the person's day or what the person likes and other things that can be useful later on in the survey if you need some help with giving examples or rephrasing a question. You want to remind the person all of those key aspects of the survey meeting as well. So asking questions. Really, really important to practice a survey with family, friends, coworkers before going out into the field again. Although you have done this survey in the past, and quite frankly there are not very many changes to the survey this year, it's still really important to practice and just kind of reorient yourself to the survey before you get out and start asking questions to people in the field. We do want you to read questions as they're written first. However, if you know terminology or examples that would support the person to better understand the question, it is absolutely fine to ask a question using the terminology that the person will know best. If after reading the question the person doesn't seem to understand it, you ought to rephrase or repeat as needed. You will have access to the Surveyor Handbook, and that offers some additional rephrasing, definitions, examples, as well as the intent of questions to help you be able to create some of your own rephrasings as needed. And of course, be aware of those skip patterns throughout the survey. Okay, so these are of course just very basic reminders of ways that you should be thoughtful in how you administer the survey. Remember, it's really important that every person have the opportunity to share their perspective and their thoughts on their services that they're receiving, the people who help them in their daily lives. One important way to do this is by remaining neutral. This is, I think, one of the more challenging pieces of surveying, is remaining neutral throughout the survey, but it is really important that we do not give feedback to a person based on how they answered that is especially positive or negative. We don't want people to seek affirmation of how they answer or feel like they're answering in a correct way. Separately, we don't want people to feel like if they get a negative response, like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. We don't want people to feel like they're giving a response that's making you feel badly, and so they would have to change how they answer. One way to remain neutral is to simply repeat back a response that the person just gave, and that allows the person to know that you hear what they're saying, but it also is done in a neutral way. Finally here, safety first. This should go without saying, but if you ever feel unsafe in a situation, leave the site. Of course, let your coordinator know. You'll also want to just let the person know. You can say something to the effect of you had a conflict come up and you can't make the meeting time. You may ask to reschedule the meeting if that seems okay for you. You can ask to hold the meeting in a different location, or perhaps have an additional person with you, maybe another surveyor or your coordinator. Really important, of course, as well, is if it seems like the person may be in immediate danger, do call 911 and or follow any kind of reporting protocol that you have in your state. All right, so we're going to end with a brief review of some selected questions from the IPS from the 2019-2020 version. These are just some of those questions that we know can be a little bit trickier that we've got questions on throughout the year. Starting with the background information section, this of course is that section that collects information on the person's demographics and some personal characteristics. This information is largely collected from state records, however you may be responsible for collecting some of this information in the field. Now the important reminder here is that only a subset of questions can be asked in the field, meaning only some questions are field appropriate, and you'll know that by that little icon with that looks like two people sitting at a table. So if you are collecting any of the background information in the field, it's important that you're only asking those questions with the field appropriate icon. Some best practices for collecting background information in the field. It can be helpful to let the person know before the meeting about some of the information in the section that you'll be collecting, and that's because the person may be able to check on some records or look up particular dates that may be helpful at getting at some of this information. For instance, looking up when the last dental exam or vision screening was. This information should always come from the best available source, so this could be the person receiving services. You may also be able to speak with a family member or staff person who can give you some of this background information as well. If the person receiving services is going to be the one to give you this information, we do ask that you do this review after Section 1 and Section 2 takes place. And this is for a couple of reasons. First, and primarily because this background information section is much more prescriptive than the section 1, section 2 of the survey. So there's a much different feel to asking these questions, and we don't want the person to feel like this is more of that kind of standard interview where really we want to set the stage for having a conversation during that section 1 and section 2 time. Additionally, some of the background information may be able to come to light as part of the survey meeting, so it just knocks off a few questions that you'll have to ask when you get to that section. Final point here, and I want to be very, very clear that this is only for the background information section, that the person can go ahead and look alongside you at these questions as well as the response options. So you can have the person sit next to you. You could even have a printout of some of these questions and hand it over to the person to complete. And that's because, again, these questions are more prescriptive and we are looking for the correct answers here. Again, this is only for those questions in the background information section because they are those more prescriptive questions. So taking a look at some specific questions within section 1 and section 2, we have the question from section 1, do people let you know before they come into your home? So I just wanted to emphasize that for this question, we are asking about people who do not live with the person. So not roommates or housemates, but people who may come to visit the person. This does mean that staff or family members who have keys are asking before they come into the home. So maybe they knock first, maybe they set up times to show up. Really what we're looking for is making sure that people still have autonomy about who comes in and out of the home. People who live in group settings, we are asking this question specifically about those who are coming to visit the person you're surveying. We don't expect that the person can have complete control over the people who visit housemates or roommates, but we do want to make sure that people who are visiting the person are setting up the right times to meet, or again, knocking or asking before they come into the home. So we'll see in this clip a good way to rephrase this question.
Do people let you know before they come into your home? Do they ring the doorbell or knock on the door first? Do people that don't live with you, that don't live in a house, do they let you know before they come into your home? Do they knock or ring the doorbell?
All right, and you see there, when Cheryl initially asks Marquise, who lives in a group setting, whether people knock before they come into the home or ask before they come into the home. So we see again here, when Cheryl first asks Marquise this question, whether people ask before coming into the home, Marquise says no, but he does live in a group setting, and so when we ask about people who do not live in the home, so not his roommates or housemates, but visitors to the home, do they ask before coming in? And we see we get a different response. Then we have this question, do you get help to learn new things? Now this is a question that's still fairly new to the survey. It can also be one that's a bit difficult for people to understand conceptually because it's a fairly abstract question. What we're asking about here, though, is lifelong learning. So being supported to learn new skills, explore interests or hobbies, and continuously learn new things. Many people might think about this kind of specific to learning activities of daily living skills or employment skills to help get a job. This is really a more broad concept, though. So it does encompass those learning ADLs and employment skills, but it can also be more to the point of just exploring hobbies and interests. So to get into this question and help the person kind of think through what we're asking here, it can be helpful just to ask if the person has any particular hobbies or interests. And then ask if the person is being supported to learn and take part in those activities. So this question is not about self-imposed rules, but really about restrictions coming from the residents. So restrictions such as there are certain times that the person can have friends or visitors over, or more specifically, that there are times the person cannot have visitors. Maybe there are particular friends or visitors who the person may want to see but are not allowed to come into the home. Or maybe there are just places within the home that friends and visitors are not allowed to go. Some people may not know the answer to this question because they have not had friends or visitors over. You may want to start by asking people whether they do have friends or visitors who come to the home. If it's a person's choice not to have friends or visitors, then we would mark this question as a 98 not applicable. Also in section 1, we have this question, do you have a service plan? This can be a really difficult question for many people to understand because it is a bit more service jargony than a number of our other questions. For this question, it's really an introduction to the next several questions that are about specific to the service plan. So this question is really an introduction to the next several questions that are more specific to the service plan itself. So it's really important here that we take a moment to help the person really understand what we're asking about. It's important to use the appropriate terminology, so whether you use service plan, maybe ISP or IPP. It can be helpful to talk to the person about the plan that includes some goals that they may have talked about at their last annual meeting. You may also want to ask family or staff before the meeting takes place some ways to help the person understand this question. So you can ask that the family member or staff when the last meeting was, where it was held, maybe some of the specific topics that were discussed that are included in the plan, and then you can use that information to help the person better understand what you're asking about in this question. So we're going to see this question being asked in two different ways, and it'll be clear that the second iteration of this is the best practice for asking this question in the field.
Do you have a service plan? Do you have a list of services that your case manager will help you get?
I don't know.
Esther, do you have a service plan? That would be an IPP, I think.
What's the service plan?
It would be an IPP. It's a plan that you usually make with your service coordinator every year, and you talk about the things, the supports that you want and need, and the kinds of services that you'll be getting, and that becomes part of your plan for your supports. Do you have a service plan?
I have one.
Okay.
In that second clip, we saw Alex took a bit of time to explain what the plan is, when it may have been discussed, some things that may be included, and that really helped Esther to understand what was being asked here. And so that's really how we want you to go ahead and ask this question when you're in the field as well. So then we have community inclusion questions, and these are the ones that start out section 2 of the survey. So starting with the number of times questions, so those are the questions that ask in the past month, how many times have you done a particular activity, like go shopping, go out for errands, go out for entertainment, etc. So ultimately for this question, we want to collect information based on a full month, the previous month of activity. However, it can be much more helpful for the person if you ask this based on the past 1 or 2 weeks of activity. If whatever they've done in that amount of time is most typical, we'd multiply that by 4 or by 2 to get at the most appropriate response for this question. Now we do know that proxy may have just helped complete or answer the question how many times a person has gone out to do a particular activity. If that's the case, as much as possible, if the person receiving services is still present, we want you to try and direct this question around satisfaction to the person receiving services. Now, if you're completing section 2 with a proxy and that person receiving services is no longer present for the meeting, that's okay, but we do want to make sure that the proxy is answering from the perspective of the person. So do you think that this person would like to go more or less or about the same? From the choice section, we have, do you choose or pick your staff? So this question is about whether the person chooses or knows that he or she can change staff if they want to, or can request at least to change staff if they want to. So if the person says that no, they did not choose their staff, it's important to make sure that we follow up and ask whether the person can request to make a change if they want to. Have you ever participated in a self-advocacy group, meeting, conference, or event? So for this question, it's really helpful if you could use some common terminology. So if there's a local self-advocacy group or maybe a chapter of a national organization that's in your area, it may be helpful to use that organization or that group as an example of self-advocacy. Also, for this question, really important to remember, if the person responds that no, they have not participated in a group meeting, conference, or event, we do want you to follow up and find out whether the person had the opportunity and just chose not to go. Just a note here, we do have a question after the self-advocacy one about voting. So have you ever voted in a local, state, or federal election? We do also include that follow-up if the person says that nope, they never voted. We do want to know if that's by choice or because they've not had the opportunity to do so. The last question we're going to look at here, do you need any of these additional services or supports? Now this is a question that comes toward the tail end of the survey. Certainly one of the longer, probably the longest question to ask, but it's really, really important that we're asking this question and doing so in a consistent and meaningful way. So super important here is to understand the intent of the question. So what we're trying to find out is whether there are services and supports the person does not currently have but feels that they need, and also whether there are services and supports the person is currently receiving, but they feel that they need some changes to. Maybe they feel that they need more of a specific service, maybe they need some help with coordinating a particular service or support. Maybe it's that they want to change the time that they receive the specific service or support. So we're really trying to encapsulate all the various ways that a person may need or want additional services. It's really important that we take time to read through the full list of items here. There are two exceptions to that, however. One is around communication technology. That question only has to be asked if the person needs some sort of communication facilitation. So if the person perhaps needs a communication device, but what we're looking for here is assistive technology. So that's only applicable if the person may need that particular support. And then respite, this is only applicable if the person is living in the family home. It may require or need some additional respite, which is just being able to take a break sometimes from their family. This question can be really helped along by bringing in information that the person may have discussed earlier. So for instance, if the person earlier in the survey said that they would like to find a new place to live, you can say that, you know, the person had. So this question can really be helped along if you have some information from earlier in the discussion. So perhaps the person had mentioned that they'd like to learn new job skills or want to get a new job. When you get to the question that asks whether the person needs some support in finding, maintaining, or getting a new job, you can talk about that a little bit. You can bring in that information that the person had already discussed.
I have some questions about other services that you might want to have, asking whether do you need any of these additional services. And this is kind of a long list, and we're just going to go through it. I think we can go through it together. And what I'm asking really is, do you need any more of these services? Like you feel like you don't get enough of this particular service, or do you need that service? Okay. So, for example, do you need any more help with having your service coordinator? Do you need any more help from your service coordinator these days?
In what way you're talking about?
Maybe being able to be in touch with your service coordinator, have conversations with your service coordinator to help with your plan. Do you need any more help with that kind of service coordination?
Sometimes I do.
Maybe. Okay, sometimes. Okay. What about transportation? Any? Do you need
I'm
help with
okay
it?
with that one.
Okay. Help finding or changing job?
I need help with that one.
Okay. Day services, like just something other than getting a job, just something to do during the day?
I have plenty to do.
Okay. What about education, taking more classes?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you need help with coordinating health care?
I get enough of that.
You get enough of that, okay. And what about dental care? Going to the dentist or
And also too.
you're okay with that? Okay. Help finding or changing your housing where you live?
Can you give me an example?
Well, sometimes people are not happy with where they live and they need help finding a different place to live or a different kind of setup for where they live, that kind of thing.
I'm okay with that one too.
Okay. What about help around the home, like help with chores? Are you able to take care of all of those things yourself?
Yeah.
Okay. Help with meeting more people or keeping in touch with people?
I'm okay with that one too.
Okay. We're almost through this list now. What about home modifications? Any kind of changes to your home to make it easier to get through?
I'm okay.
Okay. And do you get enough information about your benefits and insurance and all that kind of stuff? Do you need any help understanding your benefits and your insurance?
Yeah, I do need help with that one.
Do you need help with that? Okay. Okay. Esther, do you feel that your staff have the right training to meet your needs?
Yes.
Okay.
So again, that is really how we want you to go ahead and ask this question in the field. It does take a little bit of time to go through, but it is an important one to take the time for. And that takes us to the end. So thank you so much for your participation and listening in on this refresher training. Reminder, you will get a link to a post-training assessment, which we would ask you to complete in the next couple of days while this is all fresh in your mind. And with that, I thank you again so much and happy serving this year. Finally, we have this question, do you need any of these additional services? And this is that question that comes toward the end of the survey and includes a really long list of services. So this question, it's really important for you to know the intent of this is to determine whether there are services and supports that the person does not currently receive that he or she feels are needed, or if there are services and supports that the person is currently receiving but he or she feels that there needs to be some change. So maybe there needs to be some additional service or some assistance with coordination of that specific service, things of that nature. It's really, really important to take the time to read through the full list of items that we ask about, as well as give explanation and definition as needed for those items. Those are places where you may have some state-specific terminology as well that you can use. There are two exceptions to this, and those are for those services around assistive communication technology. If the person doesn't need communication technology, you don't have to ask about it. We do ask about respite service, but if the person is not living in a family home, you don't have to ask that question either. And finally, this is a place where it's really helpful to bring in information from earlier in the survey. So if the person had been discussing a lack of transportation in their area, for instance, when you ask about transportation, you can say something to the effect of, we talked about your need for getting around or getting more reliable transportation. Is that something that you would need? So to close this out, we are going to take a quick look at this question being done in the field in a really, really great way and really exactly how we want you to ask this question when you get out and talk to people as well.